Stop. Close your eyes. Imagine not just a building, but a time machine. A machine holding the blueprints to an alternate reality. A world where science, medicine, and philosophy were centuries ahead. Now imagine a single reckless act. A spark becoming an inferno. And in that inferno, not just wood and stone, but the only copies of 1,000,000 human thoughts burned to ash. This isn't just history. This is the ultimate true crime, a catastrophe that didn't just hurt the ancient world. It robbed you, me, and every person alive today of the knowledge of the past. It's the story of the Library of Alexandria and the fire that haunts humanity. The question is not if it burned, but how and who struck the match. The story begins not with fire, but with an obsession. A relentless, almost divine thirst for knowledge born in the wake of the man who carved a path from Greece to India, Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, his empire shattered, and one of his generals, a man named Ptolemy, claimed Egypt, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty. He made Alexandria his capital, a shining jewel, a cosmopolitan beacon on the Mediterranean coast. And his legacy? It wasn't just military. It was the construction of the Museion, the shrine of the Muses, and within it, the legendary Great Library. This was no dusty, small-town book club. This was the ancient world's Silicon Valley, its Oxford, and its MIT, all rolled into one magnificent campus. The Ptolemies were ruthless collectors. Their goal was audacious: to possess a copy of every book in the world. They bought scrolls in Athens and Rhodes. They employed translators to render Egyptian, Persian, and Indian texts into Greek. They even implemented a terrifying, knowledge-hungry law. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's magnificent harbor had its books seized. These precious manuscripts were taken to the library, copied by skilled scribes, and while the copies were returned to the owners, the originals, the most prized and authentic versions, were kept forever. At its peak, historians estimate the library housed anywhere from 400,000 to 700,000 papyrus scrolls. That might sound small to us today, but remember, each one was handwritten, painstakingly created. It was an inventory of human genius that is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine walking the sun-drenched halls. You would see Euclid, the father of geometry, who codified mathematics in his Elements, a work that would define Western education for over 2 millennia. Eratosthenes, the library's chief librarian, actually calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy, 2,000 years before Columbus sailed. You'd find the forgotten works of poets and playwrights, the medical textbooks of Herophilus, the first known anatomist who conducted public dissections, and the astronomical calculations that proved the Earth orbited the Sun, a heliocentric model proposed by Aristarchus of Samos. Knowledge that was lost and had to be rediscovered by Copernicus many centuries later. The library was a living, breathing cathedral of intellect, a place where scholars were paid by the crown to live, study, and create new knowledge. It was, in short, the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. But the pursuit of this perfection contained the seeds of its own destruction. To collect everything in one place is to place an impossibly fragile egg in a single, vulnerable basket. And the basket was about to be shaken to its foundations, not by barbarians, but by Rome.
The year is 48 BCE. The Roman general, Julius Caesar, is in Alexandria, not as a conqueror, but as an invited guest, or so he thought, drawn into the bloody dynastic struggle between the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his older sister, the legendary Cleopatra. Caesar, taking Cleopatra's side, found himself besieged in the royal quarter by the Egyptian army and navy. Trapped in the harbor, facing a massive enemy fleet, Caesar made a desperate, terrifying decision. To prevent his own small fleet from being captured or destroyed, Caesar ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian ships in the harbor. The wind that day was a cruel accomplice. The flames, whipped by the sea air, didn't stay contained to the docks. They leaped. They soared over the warehouses and the dockyards. And according to the Roman historian Plutarch, this spread from the dockyards and destroyed the great library. Wait. Stop. Was that it? Did the world's greatest treasure burn because of a tactical mistake by one of the world's most famous generals? It's the most enduring, dramatic version of the story, and the most fiercely debated among historians. Caesar himself, in his own writings about the war, never once mentions burning the library, a convenient omission for a man writing his own legend. Some scholars argue that what burned were not the main library scrolls, but the massive, overflowing warehouses of books waiting to be cataloged and processed. Still an enormous loss, but perhaps not the total, catastrophic annihilation we imagine. The simple truth is, the library, the Mausoleum, was located in the royal quarter, the exact area where Caesar was pinned down. Fire, chaos, and war raged on its doorstep. Whether it was the whole collection or just a colossal chunk of it, knowledge was lost in that moment. The single spark of Julius Caesar might not have been the final, fatal blow, but it was the first wound, the start of the long, tragic hemorrhage. Because the tragedy of the Library of Alexandria is not a single dramatic explosion. It's a slow, agonizing death that lasted for centuries. After Caesar, the library's true enemies were not just fire, but neglect and a changing world. The passion of the early Ptolemies, the obsession with collecting everything, faded with their power. The Roman emperors, while they appreciated Greek learning, poured resources into Rome, not Alexandria. Scrolls were not properly maintained. Papyrus is fragile, decaying quickly in the damp Mediterranean climate. The collection began to dwindle, the victim of dampness, termites, and indifference. But there was still a daughter library, a secondary but still massive collection housed in the magnificent temple of Serapis, known as the Serapeum. This was the last great beacon. Then came the year 391 CE. The Roman Empire was now Christian, and the Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree sanctioning the destruction of all pagan temples. In Alexandria, Theophilus, the city's powerful Christian bishop, led a frenzied mob against the Serapeum. These were not soldiers, but passionate, religiously motivated citizens. They saw the temple and the pagan texts it housed as an affront to their god. They attacked the Grand Temple, destroying the enormous cult statue of Serapis. The historical records are clear. The temple was demolished. And with its destruction, the last significant public-facing collection of the ancient world's wisdom, the last living branch of the great library, was extinguished forever. It was a clash of worldviews, a moment when the new faith aggressively tore down the symbols of the old. The mob didn't hate knowledge itself. They hated the source of that knowledge, deeming it heretical. and in their zeal they committed the unforgivable sin. They destroyed irreplaceable works of philosophy and science alongside the religious idols. This act, driven by internal religious strife, sealed the library's fate. It was no accident of war. It was a calculated, ideological erasure. But yet, the story has one more profoundly uncomfortable chapter. Centuries later, in 642 CE, the Muslim Caliph Omar's army conquered Alexandria. A story surfaced many centuries after the event, making its truth highly suspect, that the Caliph was asked what should be done with the remaining books. His alleged reply became the stuff of historical horror. If these writings of the Greeks agree with the Book of God, they are superfluous and need not be preserved. If these writings disagree with the Book of God, they are pernicious and ought to be destroyed. The legend claims the scrolls were then used as fuel for the city's public bathhouses, so numerous that they lasted for 6 months. This account is almost certainly a myth, an invention spread centuries later. But the fact that it persisted, that it became the most famous version of the story for 1,000 years, speaks to the raw, enduring fear of what knowledge can be lost when zealotry triumphs over reason. So, how did the world's knowledge burn? It wasn't a single person. It wasn't a massive bonfire. It was a tragedy of 1,000 cuts. It was the accidental, destructive fire of a Roman general. It was the slow, creeping rot of neglect and dwindling resources. It was the violent, ideological mob destroying the last great collection. It was ultimately the collective indifference of a world that stopped valuing its own history. What did we lose? We will never know. The cure for a disease? The secret to flight? Perhaps just a lost play by Euripides, or a brilliant theorem that would have accelerated the Renaissance by 1,000 years. The Library of Alexandria is not just a pile of forgotten ash. It is a monument to how fragile knowledge is. In our own time, surrounded by the digital flood of the internet, we feel safe. But what happens when the next great global catastrophe strikes? When the digital scrolls are erased? The ghost of Alexandria whispers a single, chilling warning across the centuries. Protect the knowledge, or you will be forced to discover it all over again.
But to fully grasp the colossal nature of this loss, we have to look not at the flames, but at the vacuum left behind. The destruction of the library wasn't just the destruction of scrolls, it was the crippling of an intellectual ecosystem. The Mouseion, the research institution itself, was unique. It was the ancient world's first state-sponsored think tank, a place where the brightest minds were relieved of all financial burdens so they could focus entirely on discovery. Imagine a scientist today free to research for 20 years without teaching a single class or writing a grant proposal. That was the power of Alexandria. And when the library, its resource base, and its core identity began to collapse, the scholars scattered. This scattering is known as the diaspora of Alexandrian scholarship. The knowledge didn't just vanish, it emigrated. Scholars carrying what little they could fled to places like Pergamum, Antioch, and eventually to the thriving intellectual centers of the Byzantine East and the burgeoning Islamic world. This is where the story gets its incredible twist of hope and irony. The Arabs, later accused of burning the library, became the very custodians who saved much of what Alexandria produced. They translated Greek texts on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics into Arabic, preserving them through what we in the West call the Dark Ages. Think of the mathematical concept of algebra, a word derived from the Arabic al-jabr,
Think of the works of Aristotle, which were reintroduced to Europe by Islamic scholars in Spain. But the material they saved was only a fraction of what was there. The deepest wound remains the knowledge we know we lost. And for an American audience, the implications are staggering. We pride ourselves on innovation and science, but imagine how far ahead we could have been. Consider shipbuilding. The ancient world was a marvel of maritime engineering. But the comprehensive Alexandrian texts on naval architecture, the detailed plans of the great Phoenician and Egyptian vessels, gone. We had to struggle to relearn so much about how they built the colossal ships that sailed the Mediterranean. Or consider engineering. Hero of Alexandria, a brilliant mind who worked at the library, designed an astonishing array of devices. He created the first known steam engine, a device called the aeolipile, a rotating sphere driven by steam. He invented slot machines, automatic doors for temples, and even a programmable robot theater. These were not just theoretical concepts, they were working prototypes. But the detailed instructions, the comprehensive textbooks on pneumatics and mechanics, largely lost. If that knowledge had been preserved, copied, and studied, the Industrial Revolution might have happened in 1500 AD, not 1750. We lost the maps of Ptolemy. Not the one who founded the library, but the 2nd century cartographer and astronomer. His massive, detailed work defined geography for centuries, but much of his source material, his detailed surveys, were originals housed in the library, now gone. But perhaps the most heartbreaking loss is embodied in the tragic figure of Hypatia. Born in Alexandria around 350 CE, she was a true successor to the library's intellectual legacy. She was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, the first female mathematician whose life is well documented. She wasn't an obscure scholar. She was a major public figure, respected and sought out for her wisdom. She taught Neoplatonic philosophy and mathematics, likely working in the final, decaying shadows of the Mouseion or the Serapeum. Hypatia represents the last light of the library's legacy. She was everything the ancient world celebrated: reason, logic, and intellectual independence. However, the Alexandria of Hypatia's time was a city tearing itself apart. The rise of Christianity created a volatile political environment, clashing violently with pagan and secular intellectualism. Hypatia, with her philosophical teachings and powerful influence over the city's Roman governor, became a target. In 415 CE, she was brutally murdered by a fanatical Christian mob, seized from her chariot, dragged through the streets, and gruesomely killed. Hypatia's death is often cited by historians as the final, symbolic end of the ancient Alexandrian intellectual era. It wasn't the books burning this time, it was the mind that would have written the next great book. Her death was the ultimate declaration. The muses no longer dwelled in Alexandria. The library, in spirit and fact, was finally irrevocably dead. Today, in Alexandria, a new structure stands: the Bibliotheca Alexandria, a stunning, modern, disc-shaped library that stares out over the Mediterranean, a symbolic attempt to recapture the lost glory. It's beautiful, but it's a monument to an absence. The story of the Library of Alexandria is so compelling to the modern American mind because it embodies our deepest fear, the fear of losing progress. We live in an age where misinformation spreads faster than truth, and where history is often ignored or weaponized. The flames of Alexandria remind us that a civilization is only as strong as its commitment to its own past and its own truth. The burning was a process, not a moment. A long, dark twilight of war, fanaticism, neglect, and political infighting. It was the slow, centuries-long erosion of curiosity. And the knowledge we lost? It's not gone forever, just delayed.
We eventually reinvented the steam engine, rediscovered the heliocentric model, and rebuilt our understanding of anatomy. But at what cost? Thousands of years of stumbling in the dark, held back by an empty shelf in a place that was once the shining center of the world. The ultimate lesson is simple, yet terrifyingly relevant. Knowledge is not just power, it is survival. And if we ever stop protecting it, the fire will come for us too.